Hello, everyone. This is Jennifer Mondino, Senior Counsel with the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund at the National Women's Law Center. Thank you for your patience while we confirmed that we could provide closed captioning for this webinar. We are going to go ahead and get started with our webinar today on the intersections of disability, discrimination, and sex harassment. This is the first in a two-part webinar series. Today we're going to do an introduction to the issues, and the second part of our series will be next Tuesday, also from 3 to 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time. I wanted to start by thanking all of the fantastic attorneys who have volunteered with the Legal Network for Gender Equity. We so appreciate your time and your effort and everything that it does to help us be able to connect folks experiencing workplace sex harassment with legal help and with justice. And if you are listening today and thinking, what is that? Should I join? Please go onto our website and read more about it and consider becoming a part of our network. Thank you also to folks at the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund and the National Women's Law Center for supporting our work with this webinar series, and to the many wonderful advocates and attorneys working in this space who have shared their thoughts about what kinds of things we should include in this webinar today. I am going to very briefly introduce our fantastic lineup of speakers for today. We are going to be posting a recording of this webinar after today, and you can read more about these terrific advocates then and see copies of the slides from today, access a copy of a recording of the webinar, and also find materials that our fabulous presenters may share. So that will be available on the website after today. Some housekeeping measures. We are able to see questions that people post through the chat function while we are on the webinar. So if you have questions, go ahead and send them to us through the chat feature, and we will be able to see them and have our presenters hopefully address those today or possibly bring them up on the second part of our webinar series next week. So without further ado, let me briefly introduce our speakers. First, we have Leslie Dara Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin is currently serving as the Director of National Policy for the Center for Disability Rights. The Center for Disability Rights is a nonprofit, community-based advocacy and service organization for people with all types of disabilities. She's newly in that role, but comes off of a long career of doing a lot of different work in the policy and legislative advocacy spheres, working on behalf of persons with disabilities. So we are thrilled to have her be part of our lineup of presenters today. We also have today with us Leanne Davis. Ms. Davis is Director of Criminal Justice Initiatives at the ARC of the United States, and there she directs the National Center on Criminal Justice and Disability. She brings over 22 years of experience working at the intersection of developmental disability and criminal justice, and we are thrilled to have her bring that perspective and her expertise to the panel today as well. We also have with us Deepa Goraya. She is a civil rights attorney who enforces the rights of people with disabilities in places of public accommodation, transportation, employment, education, and other areas, and who has focused in particular on improving the accessibility of websites, mobile applications, and touchscreen technology for the blind. Ms. Goraya, who is completely blind, routinely represents individuals with disabilities and disability rights organizations in federal and state court. And last but not least, we have as a presenter and also as our moderator for the webinar today, Mihal Shinar, who is a senior associate at Gilbert Employment Law based in Silver Spring, Maryland. Ms. Shinar represents employees in all aspects of employment law, including discrimination complaints, disability accommodations, and wage and hour disputes. She is a frequent presenter on disability law and sex discrimination topics in a number of different fora, and we are really happy to have her as a moderator today and also as a presenter for our webinar next week. So now I'm going to turn it over to Mihal to guide us in our discussion.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, and thank you to the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund, national organization that she has listed, which have made this webinar possible today. The first thing we're going to talk about is why we're having this conversation, why we're talking about the specific angle of disability rights and how they intersect with sexual harassment. And to address that, I'm first going to turn it over to Leanne.
Hello, thank you. So that is a very important question to be asking, is why we're here. And I think an important issue to raise is thinking about the data first and foremost. We do know that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are much more likely to experience sexual assaults overall. In fact, we know that based on data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, that they are 7 times more likely to be sexually assaulted compared to people without disabilities. And there's many different reasons for this, which I know the other panelists will discuss as well. But just looking at the history of people with developmental disabilities and the way that they have been undervalued in our society and not given the opportunities to speak out, whether it's sexual assault or other things in their lives, that's something that contributes to the overall issue around just the sheer number of people with developmental disabilities that are being sexually assaulted throughout our country. And that's in many different types of settings. But I think just overall understanding the sheer magnitude of this issue really helps helps us understand why we have to be talking about it, educating attorneys about it, our judicial system, law enforcement, so that they can have equal access to an inclusive justice system that really helps them belong and that really helps them get access to justice around these issues.
Thank you. Can you talk a little bit about some of the breakdown of these statistics in terms of particular communities within disability community that might be particularly impacted and what we know about that?
So yeah, is there a way to show the slides that I sent earlier? I'm not seeing them on my screen.
Yeah, I think we're on the third slide that you provided.
Oh,
so yeah, so we will be on the eighth slide. Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. For now, it's just not coming up on my end. Sorry about that. I think it's coming now.
There.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Now I see it. So this is some of the data, and I know that the first one is old, but I do like to bring it out to show that we have had data in this area for a number of years. And in 1991, one researcher discovered that almost 50% of people with specifically intellectual and developmental disability will experience 10 or more sexually abusive incidents. So the one thing we need to keep in mind is that this is not a one-time issue for people with developmental disabilities. It's something that they face multiple times throughout their life. And then there was some research done around children as well. And one study had found that children with intellectual and mental health disabilities, which includes mental illness, were most at risk of sexual assault. It found that they were 4 to 6 times more likely to be at risk. Another thing to consider is bullying and how children who grow up to be adults with developmental disabilities often experience bullying and how that can play into being more susceptible to sexual assault. Children were 2 to 3 times more likely to be bullied than those without disabilities. And the area around human and sex trafficking has also become more of an interest as we've found some data around this issue. And we have found that children and young adults with disabilities face a higher risk of this. And that was based on a State Department report. So that gives more of an overview of that this didn't just happen yesterday and that we have had data around this issue for a while. But the fact is that we still need even more data, not just through the Bureau of Justice Statistics, but in other areas to really help us get a fuller picture of where this is happening, which is one of the reasons that we're here today, is looking at how often it's happening within employment situations as well.
Yeah, and so to clarify what you said, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, that's compiling data found where there's violent crimes either reported or investigated, but not things that might potentially be more brought as civil cases or incidences that are just never brought or reported, correct?
That's correct. So we're actually missing a much larger number. And that's another issue, is that often these things don't get reported, and there's all kinds of issues around that as well. There's, significant barriers that women and men with developmental disabilities face in trying to report. I don't like to use the word that people are more vulnerable, because I think that creates additional stereotype to people with disabilities, but I do think that they are more at risk. And there's many different reasons for that. That's actually in another slide that I can share later on.
Sure. Now, you spoke before about this perception or just lack of attention to this issue, that sexual violence and sexual harassment isn't something that particularly impacts individual disabilities. Can you speak a little bit about this misperception and where it comes from and how to address it?
Yeah, so one of the issues is that people with developmental disabilities aren't seen as sexual beings. And that can really create a problem if you look at how we're preparing people with disabilities to live in society where they should have equal access to relationships and sexual relationships and all of the things that everybody else has access to. But when you've got stereotypes around people, it can be that much more difficult for society in general to understand that they would even be that they would even be part of sexual crimes, that they would be victims of those. So I think one of the biggest issues is really facing those stereotypes, and for our society to understand just how often these kinds of crimes are happening without them seeing that they're happening. So I think that's one of the core issues, is the stereotype.
Thank you. And one thing that we often see in the realm of disability rights issues is a common misperception that certain individual disabilities are more likely to be violent in some way, more likely to be perpetrators of crimes rather than victims of crime. And I was wondering if you can address that in the context of sexual harassment.
Yeah, so we don't, we know that we have data around how often they're victimized, and I had shared that before in the slide before, but I did want to mention that there's also one other statistic, is that they're 2 to 3 times more likely to be victimized compared to the general population. We don't have specific data on how often they are victimizing others. What we do have data on is how often they're in prison. And that doesn't tell us exactly how they got there. So we really need to be careful about making generalizations around that. And the data that we do have is definitely more about how they're becoming victims in the system and victims of different types of crime.
Thank you. And I know some of your work surrounds the issue with specifically men with disabilities and how they are impacted by this, and I believe we're on the next slide for those watching. Can you discuss that issue in a little bit?
Sure. Thank you. So the slide, I'll start with the slide that we're looking at now. This is the NPR. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Abused and Betrayed series that NPR did last year, really focusing on the issue of sexual assault of people with developmental disabilities. And in that, they looked at the story of James Metters, who you see on the screen. He and I do quite a bit of work together, going around speaking throughout the country on the issue of sexual assault of people with developmental disability. And in that series, and in the first part of that series, they talked about this rate of rape and sexual assault against people with intellectual disability being more than 7 times the rate compared to those with disability. So in the next slide, we have, if you can forward that, we have data from the Vera Institute of Justice, where they did, they talked about the 2010 National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey that found that men with disabilities were twice as likely to experience sexual violence. So that's an area that we need to consider is being not looked at, is the issue around males with disabilities. The prevalence of lifetime sexual violent victimization was 14% among men with disabilities compared to only 4% without disabilities. So in terms of, how is this affecting men with disabilities in the workplace? How what are the additional barriers that they could face as men, both being men and being, someone with a disability, and the double stigma that that they face as they consider even talking about this issue openly, or who they would report it to. So there's definitely sort of like a double whammy when it comes to serving this population and really making sure that they have the opportunity and they have a way out and they have a way to discuss this within their workplace and in other areas of their life too.
Thank you. I'm now going to turn over to Deepa and Dara and ask you to share a little bit about your thoughts about why we're having this conversation about sexual harassment and individuals with disability. Dara?
Oh, hi, sure. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. As I said, my name is Dara Baldwin. I'm the Director of National Policy for the Center for Disability Rights. I want to thank the Time's Up Absolute community and all of you who are doing what you do every day. And if no one has said it, I'm going to say it. Thank you for who you are and what you do. I come from 10 years of disability work, and we come from a space of doing disability as a civil right. And also I work in cross disability. So you name a disability we work on, and learning disability, developmental disability, as Leanne was talking about, blind, low vision, deaf, hard of hearing, physical disability, mental health. And the reason I feel we're here today is that a lot of people have misconceptions about disabilities, as well as what the law says and what it actually entails, and how people feel because you pass the law, oh, that's against the law, but implementing and enforcing it is different. And Leanne touched on a lot of the issues and concerns that people have around people with developmental disabilities. I will say many of those things are the same for probably all disabilities, as well as the Bureau of the Statistics. She was talking about it. They have different definitions of disability, which is also kind of interesting when they should be using one. But I'm going to get back to, the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, is a civil right, and people don't think of that. And really, people think of the ADA as something, about doors and ramps, and that is not it. It is a bill, it was a law passed for community integration, because, as Leanne was talking about before, in this country, people with disabilities were thought to be of no value. They couldn't do anything. They couldn't have a life. And that was proven incorrect, and they could. And so, of course, part of integrating into community is employment. Having a job, living a safe and inclusive and equitable life is having a purpose. And for most people in this country, most people around the world, that's employment. And so, of course, that is for our community. It's unfortunate when we first had these conversations around sexual harassment at work, many of us kind of not laugh, but it's like, we're like, oh, we're just trying to get our people employed. So people with disabilities are unemployed at a very high rate. When you see the numbers and they say, oh, the unemployment rate is 5% or 7%, sometimes when you look at it, it's usually double for people with disabilities, and that's all disabilities. And then also I come from a place, and when I do my work, intersectionality. And so we're not, we're forgetting that people with disabilities are all things, all faiths, all sexual orientations, all socioeconomic status, all races, refugees, immigrants, incarcerated, formerly incarcerated. So take that number and kind of double it for those multi-marginalized communities, which are probably a Black woman with a disability. Triple it for those who are probably Native American. We forget about our Native American community, and we do work with them. They are part of the Centers for Independent Living and part of the independent living community. We have what they're called CILs, Centers for Independent Living, on the Native American land. You probably quadruple it for those people who are refugees, immigrants, and things like that. And there is statistics around that. Just in the labor department. And then at EEOC, you can look at the numbers and see those people who are filing complaints. As Leanne touched on, many of our people, when they go for employment, they don't want to even disclose their disability. Some of them can do that because it's non-visible. And so doing that, all of that conversation is really hard. And so I think, unfortunately, there's not enough data or even research analysis around what this looks like. But I'm quite sure it is happening. That doesn't mean it's not happening. And so we want you all to be prepared for that. And so the other part of the conversation I was going to discuss is, how do we talk about disabilities and how do you talk to people with disabilities? And so, like I said, the ADA is a civil right. So we come from a place of that, of affirming and of empowerment, and the fact that civil rights are disability rights, and disability rights are civil rights. So when you're talking to a potential client or just someone who might say, I think I have a problem, and they have a disability, we want you to not use terms that are like suffering, because they're not suffering from whatever disability they have. We say, even if someone says, I had an onset of a disability, something happened to them, a car accident, and they're suffering from this. No, they have an onset of a disability. Their life has changed in a different way. It's kind of the same thing of, one day you're single, the next day you're married. Although some people may say that's suffering too, but anyway, but it's not like they became a different person. They just are in a different lifestyle, and something has happened to them in their life. We also don't use terms about or look at things as curing them. Many people want to cure the disability out of them, and we don't do that. Of course, we want you, if you have a debilitating disability and you're going to die or something, yes, we want you to be taken care of, cancer, those kinds of things. But we're not trying to cure them. They are who they are. And I get to the third part of this so people understand there's nothing wrong with having a disability. So when you have clients or, like I said, even coworkers or someone you want to talk to about disabilities and about their sexual harassment or something's happened at work, the first thing they already think is something's wrong with them. And so let's talk about, non-disabled people who this is happening to them, sexual harassment at work, right? All of those things that happen and all of those guilt feelings, like I did something wrong. Well, imagine someone with a disability. So that's kind of going to happen there. And I want you to know, out of all of this, if you take nothing away from this conversation, take that away. There's nothing wrong with having a disability. And I'll give you an example of my own life. I am a Black woman, and I come from a Black family. And my maternal grandfather, my mother's father, so that's not so long ago, was not allowed to finish 8th grade because he lived in Alabama. And we were told Black men, Black people can't do anything. You can't learn, you can't play sports, you can't possibly be scientists, you can't do this. And that was proven wrong because we had a man who was the president of this here United States who was Black, right? We have scientists who are Black. And so when people tell me there's something wrong, I was like, well, that's what they used to say about us. So you need to refigure how you speak and come from a positive place when you work with our community. And that's what I want all of you to do. And I know that's happening. In probably every other group you work with, at least I'm hopeful for that, and you're sitting here doing this work, so I know you come from that place. For other people, we want you to come from that place with our community. So I'll wait to talk about some other stuff because I know Deepa is also going to speak.
Yeah, so, talking about the issue of terminology and such, Deepa, is there anything you'd like to share about how to discuss both disability and sexual harassment with someone who comes to you to talk about these issues?
Sure. So I would start with, I think this is a really important issue to discuss. Often when we think of the Me Too movement and sexual harassment, we don't think of people with disabilities being sexually harassed. And I think we need to change that outlook. People with disabilities, as Dara and others were saying, are people of all characteristics, all backgrounds, they all different sexual orientations, and they go through the same things that people without disabilities do. Sexual harassment in the disability community is a real issue and often goes unreported, overlooked, because there is people with disabilities have a really hard time kind of speaking up for themselves a lot of the time, or if they do, they're not believed, or there's very real consequences to them reporting these issues. So I think this is a very important start to the discussion, and I'm glad we're having it. And I think when you're trying to discuss these issues with the disability community, you have to be able to communicate directly with the person, not with somebody else who's speaking for them, or not with somebody else who's like a caretaker, for example, or with, just with somebody else that you think will have a better understanding. Because if they are victims of this sexual harassment, they are the best ones to speak for themselves. And so I think the first step is being able to talk directly to the person and really, understand where they're coming from, really take their perception of what happened as real. A lot of times people with disabilities, maybe especially people with developmental disabilities, you might want people think, well, they didn't really understand what happened to them. They don't, they're undermining their intelligence. They didn't know that what was happening was sexual harassment. Maybe it wasn't sexual harassment. Maybe they're overthinking this. Or people with disabilities sometimes can't speak up for themselves because they might have a communication issue, communication disability. And so being able to find a way to directly communicate with them to figure out what happened is the first step, and then trying to work with them to really report that and identify the person that attacked them or was harassing them, and get the retaliation to stop, and also to just make sure that is reported, because we really need to start reporting these issues and not letting them sink into the abyss. These issues are largely unreported, but they happen all the time. They happen in all sorts of settings, which we'll get into in a bit. So I think this is just a good start to the conversation, but it's not the first discussion that we should have. This is just the beginning.
Thank you. And Leanne, is there anything in terms of terminology or best practices for communication you'd like to share in terms of effectively representing individuals with disabilities, specifically in your field of intellectual and developmental disabilities?
Thanks for asking. Yeah, what we refer to as person-first language is often something we talk about when we train attorneys and others in the field. Just simply, using the terminology that puts the person first before their disability. So it's a person with a developmental disability and not a disabled person. That shows respect and, affirming that the person is more important than the disability. There are, that's not always true for everyone, and everyone with a disability may be wants to be referred to in different ways. So it's really important just to ask the person, how should I refer to you, or how would you like to be referred to? And an example of that is people with autism. Some people would just be referred to as I'm autistic rather than saying a person with autism. So it's not always a hard and fast rule on that, but it's important to just offer, just to have that conversation with someone and to say, what is the best way to refer to you as? We do that as well when we train law enforcement officers. What I have found is that people are just even afraid to talk about disability at all, because they feel like if they say something, they're going to say it wrong, and then they're going to offend someone. So it's important to have those conversations in the beginning so that everyone understands that we're all working on this together and learning each other's terminology. And once you kind of have that conversation and open that door, it's a lot easier to have communication after that.
Thank you. And so let's talk about when you have someone who comes to you that you believe that there is a disability angle to what they're talking about in terms of sexual harassment, and they don't bring it up as the first thing. Can you share some of your thoughts about how to effectively handle this as practitioners and how to sensitively handle it so you're treating this person with the respect they want to have and gathering the information you need to effectively represent them? I'll start with Deepa.
Sure. I think looking for signs of this happening, like maybe you hear derogatory comments being said about the person in the workplace, or maybe that person with a disability is starting to isolate themselves, starting to stop socializing with their colleagues, or that person is if you see signs of depression, like they're crying or they're losing interest, or coming in late to work, or there's various signs that they just start all of a sudden acting differently. Those are good signs to look out for if they don't approach you directly. And so once you start noticing those signs, I think the best approach is to talk to the person. That's what I would look for.
And Dara?
Hello. So I don't work in this field, but I would say the kind of the same things that Dee said about. I would also I wanted to add on. I think this covers this too. Is that you may want to not only get yourself some more deep training around disability so that you can see those attributes and things that are happening, but also start interacting with the disabled community. Sometimes people do use the term disabled. That's another thing I was going to talk about, is the fact that like all languages, it changes and all titles and things change. So like, LGBTQ at a time, people did not like the term queer being used. Now it's okay. And I think what Leanne said, you have to ask and you have to find out what to say. And when you figure out that language and how you want to speak to people, there is a slide where I have kind of what we used to say and what we don't say anymore. A real easy example is people still use this term and we're upset about it, crazy. Right? We say mental health diagnoses or even visually impaired. The term impaired implies something's wrong. So like we don't use that, low vision or blind. And so when you kind of learn and you feel comfortable speaking with that community, and I think that happens for every marginalized community, right? So, men speaking to women, people who speak to also people of other faiths. Like, in certain faiths, women can't speak to men, so it's difficult for a male attorney to kind of get out what's happening. And so I think people with disabilities, I think they have the same characteristics or attributes that are happening to a non-disabled person if they are being sexually harassed. But again, as we've all been saying here, it is going to be a little more difficult to get that out of them. I would definitely start with asking the questions about how they have informed their employer about their disability, if they actually haven't been told their boss or their employer about their disability, if they have a non-visible one, and then like what is their setup and their terms and what's happening to them there. And then also I would have those flesh out those conversations, not to say that a little further, but not to say because they don't understand and know, but because also I think in the opposite way, predators are going to treat them differently. And so, or do things to them differently that may not at first appear as if that is a sexual harassment, but then later it does. And, the key here is power, right? And how does that predator use that power against, a disabled person or a person with a disability? I don't, like you would have to see that and understand that. I think Dee plus she explained that, like, what was your daily schedule? And then all of a sudden things changed. And why did that change? So you have to, unfortunately, probably be a little more of an inspector with our community because it's like peeling an onion. And then you get to you say, oh, okay, this is what happened to you. Or they changed your salary without talking to you, different ways in which they will do things. And because sometimes people will change people's salaries. They say, oh, we just did this, but they're being discriminatory towards this person with a disability. We've seen that. And so I think it's just a little different in how you're going to talk to our community about that. And I think what Leanne said, people are afraid to talk to people with disabilities, and you can't be. They're just like everyone else. And I know, sometimes, like I said, as a Black woman, some people use terminology with me and I look and I just say to them, please, I don't use that language, or let's talk in a different way about my heritage and who I am. And that's, I don't blame the person, but it happens in every conversation. And once you establish that with that person, that's what I want people to know. People with disabilities are the same way. They just tell you, please don't call me disabled, call me person with a disability. And they move on and they say, okay, now we've established that conversation. So we just want you to feel comfortable. You feel comfortable in what you do as a lawyer. We want you to feel comfortable in taking those skills and using it and talking to our community.
Thank you. And Leanne, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would just add that for people with developmental disabilities, they may not understand that what they're experiencing is sexual harassment. So that's just been a huge oversight in our society that we do not prepare people with disabilities to understand their bodies, to know what terms to use about their bodies, to really understand, you know, basic how to have a relationship, what's healthy in that relationship. There's no mandatory reason in our country why someone should get that kind of education as a child growing up in our public education system. It's not in our special education, and so we kind of set people up when they go into transitioning from, you know, having services as children and youth into adults and into employment, that if we aren't providing that education, then people are not really understanding maybe what's going on when the boss or someone in their workplace crosses over from, you know, what seems to be an innocent thing into a sexual crime. So I just feel like that's so critical that we understand that people with developmental disabilities, that population is who we work with, has not been given the tools and the understanding to even maybe know how to talk about this with an attorney, or to feel like they know where to report it, or even back up before that, understand what exactly is sexual harassment. What is it when it's a crime, and how to define that. So that's an important part of this.
Thank you. And that actually was going to be our...
Oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
The next topic we're going to talk about is the particular ways that individuals with disability are vulnerable to sexual harassment in the workplace. And you spoke about this issue of the awareness that it is something that is wrong and unlawful. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about in terms of particular ways individuals with developmental disabilities are going to be vulnerable to a workplace predator, a sexual harasser?
Yeah, I think, and I'm going to share James's story because he and I speak often together, and actually we're both sexual assault survivors, and that's why we've decided to kind of speak out about this issue together. But in his scenario, he was sexually assaulted in the workplace, and it was by someone who was the spouse of a board member that was there. So when this happened to him in a bathroom, you know, he was extremely scared, and he did not want to report because he frankly believed that nobody would believe him, because this was a person in power. You know, as Dara mentioned, this is about power, and this is someone that he believed even no matter what he said, he wouldn't be believed. And so I think one issue is just feeling like, as a person with disability, you're not seen as credible. And that is not true. The problem is we don't provide appropriate accommodations for people with disabilities in the court systems and in our criminal justice system, as victims and suspects and defendants as well. So we're not providing the accommodations that would allow someone like James to effectively access the justice system. And by not providing that, we continue this untruth that people with disabilities aren't credible, when they certainly are, and they certainly can be when given the right tools to do so.
Thank you. And I know you've done a lot of work with James. Is there anything else about his story that you want to share in regards to this issue of vulnerability in the workplace?
Well, only that I think we can't, in the story there, that James ended up in another situation. He was actually sexually assaulted 4 times throughout his life. And as I talked about before, for people with disabilities, it's more than once, usually. And he, in one instance, in the last instance when he was sexually assaulted, he was able to bring that forward, and the person was prosecuted. So I think the story here is that if we give people with disabilities if the same chances as anyone else to talk about this in the workplace, if we provide an opportunity to have an open conversation about it, and we give them the tools that they need ahead of time. So this is around prevention, you know, to know what to do when that happens, and to know what words need to be said, to know your body parts, to be able to explain this, that is going to help them in the long run, and it's going to help them to be able to communicate with their attorneys and such. So it's just real important to do the steps necessary beforehand so that we can see more success stories like James, who is now a national speaker on this topic throughout the U.S. So it's just good to have a positive example to say what can happen when people are given the tools they need.
Yes, and now I'm going to turn over to Deepa. Deepa, I know you have done a lot of work around this issue and have a lot of thoughts about ways that individuals with disabilities can be particularly vulnerable in the workplace. Can you share some of your thoughts there?
Sure. So I think they're vulnerable in many ways. People with disabilities, in the disability community, especially in the blind community, I can speak for the blind community, that there's a very high unemployment rate, at least 70 or 71% unemployment rate for blind people. And that leads to being really scared to report issues of sexual harassment or any kind of harassment, because there's, people are afraid because they're probably going to be, they feel that they're probably going to be retaliated against, or even though that's unlawful, but retaliated against, or kind of become pariahs in the workplace, and they don't want to rock the boat because they're afraid how are they going to find their next job easily when there's such a high rate of unemployment. And despite levels of education, despite degrees, all that kind of stuff, there's just a really high unemployment rate. So how are they going to find that next job, and also whether they're even going to be believed when they do report? Because at least for the blind community, they can't a lot of times see their harasser. They still might be able to identify them, but they can't really file a detailed physical description. Or it could be somebody randomly assaulting them, and they won't be able to identify that person. So there's issues with identification. There's, like I said, a person with a disability already has to advocate for themselves to get accommodations and equal treatment, and they don't want to be seen as this constant complainer as well. And so there's a myth of the person with a disability being too demanding, or having a chip on their shoulder, or constant complainer. They're afraid to add to that. And I know a lot of people with disabilities, especially developmental disabilities, are also put into sheltered workshops where they work for industries like Goodwill, for example, or other industries that really exploit them. And they're low on the totem pole. They're not allowed to go into managerial or supervisory positions, so they remain low on the totem pole, and they get sub-minimum wages. They get as little as 20, 30 cents an hour for the work they do. And that's the only job they can get, and so they're really afraid to lose that little job or little pay that they get, and so they don't want to report it then. And also, these sheltered workshops have low visibility, and so if they do report, who knows if their abuse is going to get worse or just get really bad, and so they're afraid to report for that reason as well. So those are the things that come to the top of my head, top of my mind right now. But looking forward to what others have to add.
Thank you. And Dara, is there anything you would like to add regarding for particular ways that individuals with disabilities can be vulnerable in the workplace, to a sexual predator or to sexual harassment?
Yeah, sure. First, I just want to, give a shout out to both of my co-presenters. You guys are awesome in hitting all of the things that we talk about. I want to go a little bit back to what Leanne was saying, and around people with disabilities and law enforcement. And I know you guys aren't law enforcement, but I feel when I talk to litigators, you are kind of like investigating things, right? And so also what happens in law enforcement, and it happens, I've talked to litigators too, yes, the victim is that person, but there are witnesses, right? And especially like all of us, when you're at work, you hang around the people who look like you, have the same experiences as you. I'm quite sure that person with a disability is hanging out with other people with disabilities. And don't forget those people like in your conversations, that the witnesses, like even their friends who may have a disability, they may have more confidence than the person that it's like they're the ones who see it and say, we're going to get you help. I want you to not forget those people in your work and say, who's around you, who has a conversation. And what Leanne said about reasonable accommodation, and people with disabilities will do things in different ways. And as Zeba was saying, if you're blind, they may be able to say things or tell you about the person's voice, the smell, or those kinds of things, and people forget that in their conversations. And I also don't want to put the whole, burden on you guys. There are resources out there that you guys can use, and I have a flyer with it. It's the ADA network system. In each region, there are 10 of them. They fall under DHHS, Department of Health and Human Services, and they've been around since the ADA was written, and they are there for that, resources. The website's up. There's conversations there on how to talk to people, but also how to interact with those communities. They do webinars around this. And so also there's Centers for Independent Living, which are centers where people go for services and conversations, fellowship, and conversations like this that maybe you want to interact with. And also maybe you want to provide some training to that community to say, well, this is how you will recognize sexual assault or harassment in your job, in your workplace. And these are some of the places here in Houston where we are that, will come and help you and talk to you. It's a two-way street, and we would love for that to happen. And we can, of course, make those connections for you. And where I work, Center for Disability Rights is one of those, just so you know, in Rochester, New York. But anyway, that is kind of what happens with people with disabilities. They're thought to, they can't tell us what's happening. They're not confident. They don't know these things, and that's not true. And then I just also wanted to touch on what Leanne talked about students not learning. It's the IDEA, Individuals with Disability Education Act. Now, there's no mandate in it that says you can't teach students with disabilities about their sexual life and things. And in WIOA, the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, we put transition in there for a fifth prong for the SILs. And some of the SILs around the country have taken that and unfortunately those students are usually 18 years old, probably a little late, but we still are doing it, and they're doing sexual health classes and telling them, so they know about what their body parts and their life and what happens and how these things and what it equals, and that if a person touches you someplace that they're not supposed to, they're doing all of those kind of preventative things. But as Leanne said, it should happen in high school, or middle school now, like the other students. And some people believe, although it's, like she said, it's not statutory or mandatory, that you can't teach students with disabilities that, and that's not true. And they should learn, especially our students with mental health diagnoses as well, because those are the first ones that do get taken advantage of.
Thanks. And Deepa, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I'd like to add a couple more thoughts that I just remembered right now. So there are often multiple forms of oppression. There are also people with disabilities that are immigrants, and so they might be afraid to report for that reason as well. They also may feel isolated in the workplace, like they're the only person with a physical disability. They're also a minority. They're also maybe a minority in several ways, like a woman of color or an immigrant or what have you. And so they also just may feel already different enough, and no one else really looks like them in the workplace. So they might not want to add to that as well, and by making it worse for themselves. So those are just two additional quick thoughts.
Thank you. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about additional thoughts about ways in which individuals with disabilities face barriers to reporting sexual harassment and the barriers they have to having their reports taken seriously. In the Me Too era, we've talked a lot about this as an issue for women in general, and I'd like to talk about the specific way it impacts the disability community. So let's start with Leanne.
So I think we kind of already touched on those. I talked about people not being seen as credible. I talked about, and Dara talked about, the Americans with Disabilities Act and the need to provide accommodations. So I think that was covered. So I will hand it over to the other presenters. I think I made all my points on that one.
Anything, Deepa or Dara, that you'd like to add on that point?
Nothing from my end. I think I touched upon that as well. You know, issues with identification, issues with being believed and taken seriously. So I don't have anything else to add at this point.
And Zara?
Yeah, I would just add to what was said. Sometimes people also, when they don't have the reasonable accommodations, or they don't have the way in which to say, or they don't have a relationship with the person who is taking the report or things like that, that's a barrier. As well as some people do have issues and concerns with their families. We haven't talked about that. And in the disability community, we do have a lot of, well, not a lot, thank gosh, it's kind of going away, but not as far. We have paternalism, where we have parents who are like, woe is we, and they can't take care of themselves. And so, you know, we have people who with disabilities who have finally gotten away from their parents, you know, either civilly, you know, in a lawsuit, or they just walked away and they said, I'm going to be this person with a disability and independent, and they're living on their own and they're doing it, and then this incident happens to them at work, and, you know, they don't want to report it because, as all the things Deepa was talking about, I lose my job and now I'm not independent and my parents think that I can't do it. And so the whole paternalism is like, see, I told you, you couldn't be on your own. And so, you know, not to say that that doesn't happen in a lot of other communities, because it does. I'll say this, it never happened in my house. My mother would get out, you got an education, but no, I want to, but, you know, it is something that is kind of embedded in the disability community, more so than I've seen in other communities. And it's a different way. Like, people talk about immigrants who all live in the same house and, you know, they don't leave. That's not paternalism. That's kind of how, right, Europeans live. That's kind of how South Americans live. Everyone lives in the same house, mom, grandparents, you know, Asian Americans. That's part of their culture. And they're all there as a team. Everyone's putting into the same pot. You know, they're taking care of the children. They're, you know, worshiping together, all of those things. It is different in the disability community when that happens and you have paternalism. The parents are actually taking control of that child or that youth, that person's life. We've had cases where people could not vote. Their parents are like, no, we don't want you to vote. We don't think you're competent enough to vote. We've had people who, you know, that's a different thing than being a community and your culture of all living together. And so that paternalism there, if this person has gotten away from that paternalism, they probably, and they may not report their sexual harassment at work or anything that's happening to them at work, because they don't want their parents and that family coming back into their circle. And so that is a unique thing to the disability community. So I just wanted to bring that up.
Thank you. And Deepa?
Yeah, I definitely agree with what Dara was saying, the cultural aspect of it. You know, I've heard from blind people and other people with disabilities of various cultures that, you know, in some cultures, sexual harassment is like a taboo. You don't really talk about sexual harassment or any sexual stuff. And, you know, and some people with disabilities are still dependent on their families for some financial support or healthcare or what have you. So, you know, maybe that paternalism can come in there. But if you report it, you're going to be it's going to be maybe blamed on you, or it's just a real delicate subject to talk about. And then there might be retaliation from your family. There might be, you know, like Dara was saying, like, oh, I told you you couldn't be on your own and we're supporting you, you have to come back home, or, you know, that kind of thing. So there's all sorts of risks with reporting it, not just reporting it in the sense of like to the police or to your boss or whatever, but within your own family if there's issues around reporting issues as well. So that's just something I wanted to add.
Yeah, and one thing I'll add that I've seen in is that, you know, we still do have a system of employer-provided health care, and that for many employees, the risk of potentially losing your health care factors into whether or not they want to take risks in reporting something shaking the boat. And individuals with disabilities who have often higher healthcare needs and might be especially more acutely concerned about losing that can be something that's factored in terms of whether or not they're willing to go out on a limb, because we all know that even though retaliation is unlawful, it happens all the time. And that, I think, is something that's important to discuss with a potential client about their concerns about that and what it means, because it's a real fear. Go on.
Oh, yeah, Jennifer, this is Dara. I was going to say, right, retaliation from law enforcement, but then retaliation from your own support system, that, trumps everything, right? Like, that's where it's going to come from. Like, they're not going to report it if that's their support system.
And this is Leanne, and I would just add, too, that we've had cases here at our National Center on Criminal Justice and Disability. We take information referral from all over the country, from people with disabilities who are needing help, to attorneys, to law enforcement. And we did have a call related to this where the mom had called in for the adult daughter, saying that she thinks that she's being sexually assaulted when the daughter was saying it was consensual. So that does add quite a bit, not having that support person to support you if something like this happens in the workplace. And you also have to consider that perhaps they are also being sexually assaulted at home as well. So these are definitely layers that that people who don't have disabilities face, in addition to everything else that the other panelists have talked about.
Yeah, thank you. I now want to move into a discussion of the particular ways in which individuals with disabilities might be harmed by sexual harassment. I think one of the things that the Me Too movement has given more voice to is the extreme harm that people suffer when they are in any way sexually harassed, and that has been something that's underappreciated and undervalued for a long time. And I'd like to turn to you to talk about that issue with individuals with disabilities. So I think we'll start with Leanne. I know she has the next slide available for us to look at.
Okay.
Go ahead, Leanne.
Let me make sure I'm seeing the right slide that you are. It's slow on my end to come up. Sorry. So I'll start just by saying that we know that sexual violence causes a number of harmful psychological, physical, and behavioral effects. We've seen people with developmental disabilities end up pregnant, for example, and if you're following the national news, you've seen cases such as the one in Arizona where no one even knew anything was going on, and then the person actually ends up pregnant and they had no idea how that could happen. There's also other like psychosomatic symptoms such as stomach aches and headaches, seizures, and problems with sleeping. But then there's the psychological piece of this when you're not addressing trauma that could include depression and anxiety, panic attacks. There's this feeling of shame and guilt and irrational fear as well. So the ones that I highlighted on the slide here that are in yellow are the ones that when James and I provide presentations, these are the ones that really most affected him as a survivor. He thought that he might get HIV, and that really was a big concern to him. He was afraid of that. He really struggled quite a bit with depression, loss of trust in people. And I think one of the biggest issues is the shame. And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of people who can provide that kind of trauma-informed care for people with disabilities. In our country, we don't put a priority on training counselors around these issues. And so it becomes a real kind of gaping hole in terms of how do we really provide support when these effects of sexual violence are happening to people. And I think another thing I did want to mention too, when we talked about behaviors and what kinds of behaviors we're seeing in people with disabilities, unfortunately in our field, we've called problem behaviors what is actually the result of trauma in someone's life. So in the disability field, we use things like applied behavior analysis, and we try to treat people. And when we're not really looking at the underlying trauma that people with developmental disabilities have faced probably throughout their lives, but they've had no opportunity or no no ability because they haven't been given the tools to talk about what's happened to them. So that ongoing not being able to talk about it, it kind of can create this cyclical effect of living in this depression and feeling shamed, so that if it happens at work, they've already experienced it 3 times or however many times before. That one study said they're likely to experience it 10 times. Then you get into a workplace setting and you just feel like, what's the use? So all of these things kind of can lead to future victimizations as well, unless it's dealt with and people are provided the support they need.
Thank you. Deepa, do you have anything to share about the particular ways individuals with disabilities may be impacted by sexual harassment?
I think I don't have anything to add at the moment to what Leanne said. I may later on, but not right now.
Okay, and Zara?
Yeah, sure. It also, everything Leanne said, and it also leads to a lack of healthy relationships. Also, in the disability community, there's a higher rate of non-married people or non-community people, even if they're, not living with someone. They may be living with someone who's their friend, not their partner in life or things like that. And it comes from that as well, especially if they've been abused, as Leanne said, so many times. They don't know when someone actually cares for them and loves them. And I know that, of course, happens in the non-disabled community as well, the able community, but it's at a higher rate. And we also see people with their sexual orientation not knowing, am I gay, am I lesbian, all of those LGBTQ, what it is, and not being able to identify and actually live the life they want to live. So we see that in the LGBTQ community because of what's happened to them as far as the sexual assault and that applied behavioral system, which is horrible, and instead of really talking to them. And Leanne touched on this a little bit. I work on mental health. I work on mental health law. If you read the 21st Century Cures, the end of the bill, they tacked on. And they had not increased funding or done anything around services for mental health in 15 years, and we kind of finally got that done. And so also we see a lot of clinicians, it's sad to say, and clinical people who also take advantage and do sexual assault on our community. Again, this happens in, to non-disabled people, but it's prevalent. And so here it is again, they come to us, they tell us something happened to them, we're going to get them help, this person who's supposed to help them, and then they do something to them as well. So that, also happens in our community. And then they shut down. We see also a lot of isolation, and especially around different disabilities. The number one isolated group that you'll see in the stats is deaf people, and so sometimes, you have wellness checks. That's why we have wellness checks for this community. And people think wellness checks are only for people with mental health, and they're not. They're for all disabilities. And then, we have people don't understand why people have service animals. Some people have service animals because of this, because they can't have a real loving, kind relationship with a person or a human being because they have been abused so much. And that service animal, emotional, and it could be an emotional, but it's definitely could be a service animal as well, who will make sure that person's alive. And if that person isn't alive, they tell the community, or they know how to let people know. They tell them how to take their medication, make them go out because they got to walk that dog or that animal. And so those are things and ways that people, yes, it's prevalent in the able-bodied community, but it's more prevalent in the disability community.
Yeah. And Deepa?
Yeah, so now I just thought of something. There are relationships. People with disabilities often depend on people to help them, like caretakers, for example, or depend on somebody for transportation, or there are dependent relationships as well. And maybe that person who they're relying on is their support system, is their only means of support. And so if that person is the harasser, there can be issues with that as well, like not wanting to report because they don't know where else they're going to find help, or that person, the harasser, has so much control over the person with the disability that the person with the disability just cannot, maybe doesn't realize what's happening, or they just cannot. It's like the abused wife syndrome, where they're just so controlled they just can't get out of it. So that's something that I've observed as well in the community, that there are very just controlling relationships because the person with a disability is relying on that person for various things. There are just abusive relationships, not just sexual, but just in general emotional abuse and stuff like that. People with disabilities already, a lot of times, already face low self-esteem because they've been, you know, throughout society they've been just demeaned because of their disability, or meant to feel weaker, or meant to feel like their disability is something wrong with you. That they're just already so low in self-esteem, and they just may have issues around being able to stand up for themselves in general.
And Jennifer, can I add to that?
Yeah, this is Michal. Yes, go on, Sarah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Diva, thank you. You remind me. What Diva was talking about is exactly what I was saying. That people with disabilities, like, they can live and should live in the community. They just need support, and some of them need personal assistance. And that lifeline is imperative. If they don't have that personal assistant, as Diva was saying, you know, to bathe them, clothe them, shop them, everything, then they may have to go back to an institution. So it's deciding between being abused and going back to an institution. Many of them will say, I'll just be abused by this person. And finding personal assistance is not easy as well. And so I think that's that whole conversation around what community integration is and means. And that's the safety part of it.
Yeah, and Leon, I know that one of the individuals that your organization or you advocated for faced the choice between leaving her basically a group living situation if she wanted to get out of the sexual abuse environment. Can you speak more to that dynamic that some individuals with disabilities face?
Yes, and I know the panelists have already talked about this, but I don't think it can be overstated just how much someone risks to lose if they choose to report any kind of sexual violence that they've experienced. In one case that we worked on, the individual did, you know, face losing where she lived. And when these kinds of, because I mean, these kinds of abuses are happening in many different areas throughout a person's life. Employment is one of them. But the risk is so great, you could lose where you live if it's someone that, maybe it's even someone with a disability that lives there. But then if you report it, then you have to go somewhere else. And if it's in the workplace, then you lose your job, as the other panelists talked about. And it's so difficult to have a job in the first place, you know, when you have a disability. And you could gain a reputation of being someone who is just saying that they're sexually abused or that they've been assaulted in some way, and will people continue to believe you? So I think the biggest problem is that our systems are not set up to serve people with disabilities who are victims of crime. Our systems within our larger criminal justice system, our systems in employment, on how are we, you know, providing a path for people to be able to be open about these issues. And then on the other side, people who even maybe want to help a crime victim with disabilities don't know what to do either. So it's just critical for us to be providing those really clear strategies on how do we address each part of this system and the person who is going through the system and at each stage of that system. And that's what we try to do with our Pathways to Justice training from the National Center. We actually break down these issues, and we have a module focused on victim service providers specifically, so that if they're trying to help someone with a disability, whether that's through a rape crisis center or other areas, then they have some training on how to do that. And we also have a module for attorneys too, so that attorneys have a better understanding of this issue overall and how they can directly support a crime victim with disability.
It's great, and maybe we can share a link to those resources for attorneys after the webinar. We've had a few questions coming in as we're getting towards the end of the hour, and so I wanted to present them to you. The first question we had, which I think will be for Leanne, is an issue regarding capacity for consent. And attendee wanted to know if you could speak to standards for determining whether a particular individual with disability is capable of consent, and how you would handle those issues if when someone is coming to you and saying, I did not consent, and the kind of barriers they would face to addressing their capacity or incapacity for consent.
Wow, that's a great question. And I'll first say that I'm not an attorney. I'm a social worker who's been in the field for many years, but this issue specifically caused me such angst that our National Center did create a white paper on this topic around capacity and consent, because it is really difficult to understand unless you're in this issue day in and day out, and really understand some of the intricacies of the law around this. But we do know that this is an incredibly important issue that we're trying to equip advocates to understand how people can make their own decisions around these issues. And I'll throw out another term called supported decision making, which is something that we're looking to try to replace guardianship with, that allows people to make their own decisions when they're given all the information in a way that they can understand it. And consent is similar to that, in that we are trying to help people understand what is it that they're about to enter into. You know, do they understand fully the implications of being in this relationship? And so I will just say that we have a good publication around the consent issues that we can hand out further, but I would love to hear from the other panelists too, just more the legality of all this and maybe how they've approached it with their clients.
Sure, I'll turn it over to Deepa and Dara. Do you have anything to add?
I haven't really worked on these issues much, but I do know about supported decision making. I oftentimes this you can use that a person with a maybe intellectual or developmental disability may you be able to rely on a guardian or a guardian ad litem or some kind of person that's helping them make supported decision making, and that's a good way to get at the consent issue. But I'll turn it over to others who may have more experience in that.
Sure, and Dara, do you have anything to add?
No, I was going to say exactly what both have said. I would just add the CILs, the Center for Individual, they do have trainings and conversations around this and can help you. They do, each one of them have a violence and abuse kind of task force or working group, something inside of them where they do this work. And then also, they're not here, but that's who I used to work for is the Protection and Advocacy Program, which one is in every state. You might want to reach out to your local protection and advocacy program, and you can go to NDRN, the National Disability Rights Network, or I used to work, you can Google that, .org. On their website is a map and a list of the states, so click on it. And, there are attorneys there, and they will help you and have those conversations with you. And I'm sure probably some of you might have worked with them on cases and things like that. And they also have social workers there, as Leanne is, to also help around that. And we are trying to push supportive decision making and doing that in that way. But it is a very thin line, and it's hard to talk about. I would just add to it also, as we were talking about before, the intersectionality, when you add in those other multi-marginalizations, that's also a problem, right? As someone who doesn't speak English, or someone who, comes from a different culture and may not understand what consent means. Consent can mean something different in China than it means in the United States until they're here. And so those are also barriers that we face when it comes to that.
Sure. And I'll just add that when we talk about consent and sexual harassment, one thing that I see a lot from the employer side or from the alleged harasser is this idea that, it was consensual, whatever happened, and ignoring the kind of power dynamics that go on, taking anything other than an absolute, firm monologue declaration of all the reasons why this is unwanted and wrong as consent. And I think that is magnified when it comes to individuals with disabilities. for all the reasons we talked about, why they might be hesitant to speak up, feel particularly vulnerable about speaking up. But I think we should be mindful that consent can sometimes be an improper defense asserted that someone was consenting to something when we have employment law standards, we have sexual harassment standards, and these things are often not what the law defines as consensual in the workplace. We have another question in. We want to, we were asked if the panel can share thoughts on someone not reporting sexual assault or harassment because they are, quote, one of the few, quote unquote, lucky individuals with the disabilities who have a job, and how that might impact this issue. Would anyone like to respond to that?
Repeat the question.
Sure. They said, some people, that the issue of someone feeling that they're, quote unquote, the lucky ones of individuals with disabilities, that they have a job in the first place. I think we touched on this before, if you'd like to add anything.
I can start. So they might not want to report this issue of sexual harassment because they are, quote unquote, lucky and have a job, and it's such a hard thing to have a job as a person with a disability when you look at the unemployment rate. And so they don't want to mess that up. They don't want to do anything to jeopardize that. And so they may just wish to try to ignore the issue or just not report it to anyone that would that may affect their employment status. And so, that is oftentimes why people don't want to report it as well. That's all I have to say on that.
Yeah. We have a few minutes left, and I think I want to turn this more to the stories of some of the individuals around the country who our panelists all know that have been impacted by this issue. I know that, Leanne, you spoke about James. Is there any other stories, whether anonymously or with someone's name, that you'd like to share for people to understand this issue?
Well, actually, I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the things that concerns me as working at our National Center on Criminal Justice and Disability is that we don't have more stories being reported to us from people with disabilities throughout the country. Most of the calls that come into our center are around defendant issues, and given that we know the data on how often this is going on, it really speaks to this larger issue that people just don't even feel comfortable, don't feel safe, don't have the the kind of the infrastructure they need around their lives to even be talking about this. So, I saw that in James's life, and I've seen that in the lives of other people that I've worked with very closely, to really understand the barriers that they face in addition to other survivors out there without disabilities, and they really are quite significant. So, I think that's something to take away from this webinar, is just to understand, again, I go back to the sheer magnitude of how often people with developmental disabilities are facing sexual violence in their lives, throughout their lives, and how incredibly important it is that people who are on this webinar today understand the gravity of this and do whatever they can to learn more about this issue and to really do more outreach to these individuals, whether it's directly as an attorney working with this population or reaching out to organizations such as this one and Dara's and others, the panelists, who can really help provide that training. Because without that support, truly their stories are going to continue to be unheard, and they're going to feel completely defenseless on the job when some kind of sexual harassment happens.
Thank you. Deepa?
So I was just going to share an anecdote of somebody that I know in the disability community that I read about actually on social media, and this person had an extremely abusive relationship. It wasn't sexual harassment, it was physical harassment, but it's relevant because she had a disability, and it goes to the issue of why she didn't want to report. She had a relationship with somebody who was just very abusive, and her family was actually saying, because her boyfriend was not disabled and she was, and her family was actually saying how lucky she is to be in a relationship with somebody who is not disabled. And they, when she kept saying, I want to leave this person, not telling him about the abuse, but just saying she wanted to leave. Or I believe even when she did say that he was being abusive, they were just encouraging her not to. And they were saying, you're so lucky to be able to find a relationship with somebody who's not disabled. And she didn't want to mess that up. And so she kept enduring it. And it got to the point where it just became too much to tolerate. And so she did eventually get out of that relationship. But it just took a long time because like we were saying earlier, like her family and her support system was actually discouraging her from reporting or from doing anything about it because they had such a negative outlook on disability. So I just wanted to share that story because it highlights some of the issues that we were talking about.
Thank you. All right, well, we're coming to the close of our time for this webinar. Thank you to everyone who presented, to Deepa, to Dara, to Leanne. We'll have materials available on the website afterwards and a link circulated. And thank you to everyone who attended to hear about this important topic. Next Tuesday at the same time, 3 o'clock Eastern Standard, we're going to be having our second part of our webinar, which is going to be involving litigation strategies and things to know as attorneys handling these cases. As we heard today, this is a really important issue, and there are a lot of people out there who are individuals with disabilities who are victims of sexual harassment and sexual assault. And as the attorneys on the ground working on the Me Too movement, I think it's really important that we think about how we can address their issues and how we can best serve this population so that this matter can be, as we say, time's up for everyone who is committing these kinds of horrible abuses. Thank you.